To today's session on ramping up with FedRAMP. My name is Cynthia, and I am a program manager at Capsule8, and I'm one of those people who just reads way too much about compliance. But you might be here because maybe you've been asked recently, we want to be FedRAMP compliant, we need to get FedRAMP compliant, how long is it going to take? Or maybe you have a specific government agency your organization wants to do business with. Or maybe you're just a private organization and you might be interested in these compliance standards because they are among the most rigorous. And you know that once you implement the appropriate security controls, once they're in place, that you'll be able to use these repeatable processes to demonstrate compliance. And while FedRAMP maybe is a stretch goal or an ultimate goal, you know that working towards the implementation of these controls will develop repeatable processes. And these repeatable processes can produce audit evidence, and you can gain some additional attestations maybe in the immediate term. Or maybe you just love acronyms. You can't get enough of them. Maybe you play a lot of Scrabble. And you thought this presentation might come in handy, and spoiler alert, it will. But the acronyms and the control selection process, the accreditation paths, the governing bodies, they often get mangled when we talk about FedRAMP because FISM is typically in the same breath. So today we're going to break all of this down. And my goal today for you is to be able to walk away from this session with an understanding of the primary differences between FISMA and FedRAMP, to understand which compliance standard your business may want to pursue depending on the needs of the organization, and to understand the path to certification and accreditation, which will hopefully inform the additional steps you may need to take in the short term to vet the different controls to be able to better answer that question, when are we going to get there? And we're going to do this by talking through some real-world lessons learned in the field. So the Federal Information Systems Management Act, or FISMA, came into being in 2002 as legislation. And the goal was to present a unified way to strengthen the U.S. government's security posture. It requires private sector vendors to implement information security controls that ensure data security postures of federal information systems are protected. And again, FISMA was legislation, so it's a law enforced through a process described in the Office of Budget and Management's circular called A130. The control selection, the implementation, the testing, this would be done by your organization's IT professionals. In order to be FISMA compliant, you would receive an authority to operate, or an ATO, by the individual government agency you are doing business with. So it's legislation. It requires individual government agencies to look at how you've strengthened and protected the security and privacy laws set forth in A130. And it really speaks to how to manage information as a strategic resource. So an example of how this may play out in the real world today, and certainly prior to FedRAMP, which came into being in 2011. As an example, you have a widget that you want to build for a specific government agency, or you want to bid on a widget to build for a specific government agency. You win the bid. You would go to the guidelines set forth in A130. And again, spoiler alert, a lot of those controls and processes dovetail and overlap with FedRAMP, which came in 2011. But at the end of it, an authorizing official would sign a formal statement of risk acceptance, of your organization's risk acceptance, so that you would be able to get an ATO from that individual agency to do business with. So again, prior to FedRAMP, an organization wanting to do business with a federal agency would follow these guidelines, and the government agency, the individual government agency, would issue the authority to operate. And it would be based on the agency's individual standards and requirements. So it was a lot to manage if this was your business of working primarily with government agencies on both sides. It's a one-to-one transaction between an organization and a government agency. And your ability to get an ATO is really dependent on the risk tolerance and the standards of that individual government agency. For FISMA, again, if you want to do business with multiple government agencies, you would have to have a separate ATO or authority to operate for each individual agency. And in walks FedRAMP. The Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, or FedRAMP, came into being in 2011, and it was part of the Office of Budget and Management, same governing body. It was part of their cloud-first endeavor, and it gave organizations who want to do business with multiple government agencies a very standardized approach to security assessments, to authorization requirements, and guidelines on continuous monitoring practices for cloud products and cloud services. So again, before FedRAMP, every agency was somewhat assessing risk based on their own risk appetite and the posture of the organization they were doing business with. With FedRAMP, it's no longer a one-to-one relationship, but a one-to-many relationship. And because of this, it is an entirely different certification and accreditation process. The FedRAMP marketplace provides a list of products which are authorized or in a review status for all government agencies to leverage. So the accreditation process is an entirely different game. FedRAMP was designed to help commercial organizations get the stamp of approval to sell cloud services to any government agency. FedRAMP was created by what's called the Joint Authorization Board, or the JAB. The JAB has representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, the General Services Administration, and the Department of Defense, the DoD. And it's really more than just compliance guidelines. It leans in the direction of a risk management framework, in that it isn't just about meeting very specific controls, but it's about repeatability and evidence that you can continuously monitor to make sure there isn't aberrant behavior and that you're always in compliance. So FedRAMP and FISMA have some guidelines in common, for sure. They both require an impact analysis as defined in FIPS 199 and 200. And this goes through a categorization defining high, moderate, and low risk impact. They both lean on NIST 853 for baseline compliance controls, but there are some key differences. So for moderate to high impact levels, as once you go through the FIPS 199 and 200 assessments, there's between 70 to 200 additional NIST 853 controls to gain FedRAMP ATOs. FedRAMP also has very clear and stringent guidelines, and they're defined and they're leveraging NIST 837, and they're around continuous monitoring, change management, and reporting. So to get that FedRAMP certification and accreditation, you must work with an accredited independent assessor via the 3PAO program within FedRAMP. And the 3PAO stands for Third Party Assessment Organization. And the 3PAOs have their own kind of process and guidelines to continue to be a 3PAO. It's very strictly regulated. And there are two types of FedRAMP authorizations. There's the ATO, their authority to operate, similar to FISM, but it's usually acquired in 4 different phases, typically. First, you would establish a partnership, and that would be identifying your government sponsor who would basically say, I want to do business with you and sponsor you to go through the FedRAMP process and accreditation process. And once you've established your sponsor, you would start to do the security assessment. And this is where you're going to start to really dig in, understand what you have, where there's gaps in tools, where there's gaps in processes, and really start to be able to size out the kind of scope of the effort involved. Then there's the actual authorization process. And this is where you're really going in, they're looking at the ATO, and other agencies are also getting to look at that ATO. It's not just for your sponsor, but for all agencies have access to review the ATO. And then you would have to be able to prove your ability to actually execute NIST 837. And that goes to the continuous monitoring aspects of FedRAMP. And you would have to be able to produce evidence, not only that you meet these standards, but that you can monitor to make sure there aren't any, again, aberrant behavior that would make you fall out of compliance at any point in time. And then there's a provisional ATO or a PATO, and that is given by the Joint Authorization Board at the JAB. Again, it has representatives from DHS, GSA, DOD. It's more challenging, and your readiness level kind of has to be next level in terms of going after a PATO. And I want to talk through some lessons from the field, lessons I learned the hard way, and hope that you don't have to repeat them. So first of all, I think a lot of organizations look at kind of the FedRAMP guidelines and scope of effort. And the first thought can often be, oh, well, I'll lean on my offshore resources to help me kind of pull together some of that documentation or implement some of those tools. No. For FedRAMP, all of this has to be done onshore. You must work with onshore resources for process implementation and for documentation. The other thing that I've seen is that NIST 837, specifically for startups or growing businesses that are growing rapidly, that have the expectation from stakeholders that you can add new services very, very quickly. So NIST 837, the controls or the guidelines around change control, that can be kind of like trying to build a car as you're driving feeling. Just kind of a heads up there. To sponsor or not to sponsor. The provisional ATO is more challenging. It's not done in stages like an ATO where you can kind of work through the different, kind of pace yourself a little bit more. But finding a sponsor can be challenging too. And that is required for an ATO versus a PATO. And do not underestimate the additional attachments beyond the security assessment plan. There are 13 attachments, which in many cases must be in specific FedRAMP templates. And these attachments range in all kinds of things from like privacy threshold analysis to privacy impact analysis. You'll have to go through an integrated inventory workbook where you're not only itemizing physical assets, but people and roles and responsibilities and how they map and what they have access to. And even say if you have great BCP and DR documentation, you're going to have to move those into FedRAMP specific templates. So again, being able to answer very quickly, how long is it going to take, really is the assessment itself is going to take a long time. And I'd say one of the biggest lessons learned is to take advantage of automation. Specifically, as much as possible, implement security tools which give your staff accurate, actionable, and real-time details on security events, because this gets to the heart of NIST 853, which again is the baseline for most of the FedRAMP controls. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Depending on the maturity of your documentation, the existing processes you have in place, most FedRAMP assessments, prep and assessments and implementations can take anywhere from, I'd say on the low end, 4 months up to easily 18 months, depending on how many resources you put towards the effort. It's going to depend. And just keep in mind that at the end of the process, you're going to have between 400 to 600 pages of documentation. And your ability to be able to repeat process, to have automation in place, is going to be key to be able to maintain your FedRAMP ATO or PATO. So again, FISM legislation from 2002 is a one-to-one transaction. FedRAMP is a one-to-many transaction, and it really leans towards a comprehensive risk management framework more than a compliance standard, and it has a very different path for accreditation and certification. So I don't want to leave you completely scrambling, swimming in acronyms here. In this presentation, these are actual hyperlinks to all of the controls and frameworks that we've talked about throughout this presentation, taking you directly to either the website or the PDF itself. You'll want to review these further in order to answer that question. When are we going to get there? So I hope this was helpful. Thanks again for joining.